meant to record. Now I'm recording. Anyways, so in designing Central Park and the surrounding suburbs, he inputted those concepts of the lawn, and it kind of spun off from there. There's another guy that in these suburbs created this lawn care requirements guide, Abraham Levitt. And he kind of started handing around these packets of like, okay, if you want a good lawn, this is what you have to do, which is then became our habit of fertilizing, mowing, and having those nice fine line, like fresh lines in our lawns. Other reasons for having a lawn would be sports. Golf became really popular, and that's kind of where that lawn maintenance also was utilized. It can also be a means for pest control. By having that short grass, you're less likely to have critters coming into your and bugs into your house if you have that kind of low space. So one of the main concepts of today was the trying to change people's mindset of what it means to garden and to have a lawn. If you think about how much time you spent trying to keep critters away from your plants, and the amount of tending to the garden, taking out the weeds, mowing the lawn, and then one of the concepts for creating habitat would be you have that upfront work, but then over time, it would become less work and less energy spent into them. And then as part of the garden, once it's established, it can kind of, you kind of protect it at first, but it can handle little nibbles here and there from like your deer and rabbits. And I really like to assign, if something is not eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem, which is kind of a really big concept for this workshop. I looked up the amount of money an average American spends on gardening per year and found that it was around $500 a year on garden supplies and plants. And obviously it depends on how large of a garden or elaborate your garden is, but on those standard gardens that are full of annual plants that need to be replanted each year, that's a lot of money that ends up happening versus a native garden is full of perennials, so they'll come back each year. So you don't have to buy new plants once you install them. So the need for habitat, as I'm sure many of you are aware, our pollinators and birds are in trouble for lack of habitat or food. So by creating these gardens with in mind that you're providing pollen, a host plant, our butterflies and moths and a variety of bugs require a very specific plant to grow up on. Plants that have berry production, nesting material, providing that bug habitat. One thing that some bugs love to do is put their eggs in stems of plants, and then over the winter they'll grow and then they'll hatch the next year. Need for wet spaces, bug habitat, a safe space for our frogs and salamanders and also turtles. And down at the bottom is Michigan's only lizard, a skink. So by creating some of these spaces, we could welcome, it might take a few years for them to find it, but if there's, like you make a rain garden, you might find some frogs or salamanders are suddenly under some, in that space. The wood turtle is also a species of special concern that relies on kind of that mix between, and same with like a Blanding's turtle. Another thing that could be, that is harming some of these, especially like those more, the frogs and salamanders that kind of have that more skin contact and absorb stuff more quickly, the use of all that fertilizer and pesticides on our lawns really harms them. So by creating that space in your lawn and reducing your use of those, then you're kind of protecting them on that. And a big thing with all creatures is that habitat loss. So by creating this even small habitat on your land, you're providing them with more space to grow and supporting them. Some of our small mammals are thought of as vermin and creatures that we don't want anywhere near us, but they do all have that purpose. Our moles and stuff kind of aerate the ground and eat all the bugs in the ground. Our possums. Possums actually eat a lot of like nasty bugs like ticks, which are going to be a problem, especially after the more mild winters we have. The higher those tick populations are going to be. So our possums are a friend, as I like to say. And they, I mean, they're America's only marsupial, so that's pretty cool too. So as I mentioned in the explaining what a lawn was, one of those things was as pest control. So you might be wondering, okay, if I'm creating this habitat, I'm inviting all these critters right near my home. What's going to stop them from getting in? And before you go and create this habitat, you can kind of determine a buffer of like, okay, I want this space away from my walls or windows so that that habitat is further away from your home. You can go around and check your house for any holes, and you can use expanding foam like in the picture, or caulk, or just like make general repairs, anything that you've been putting off. That'll reduce the chances of things like mice or ants getting into your house. Deterrents and should be used sparingly if nothing else works, kind of thing, because there's insecticides and rodenticides that can cause major harm. If you have a mouse that eats it and goes out, and then you get that bird of prey that comes and tries to eat it, that bird of prey ends up being intensely ill from that rodenticide. So reducing the uses of those and only using where especially needed, like around windows and not your entire home, is really important. I read that boric acid could be used sprinkled on ledges that are hard to keep them away, and that especially works for ants. So what types of habitat could you make around your home? It'll depend a lot on how much sunlight you have, the soil type, which could be done with a simple, you grab like a handful and then you kind of rub it in your hand, and there's charts available online of if it does certain things, it can categorize it down to specifically what type of soil it is. In Midland, I imagine a lot of it's probably going to be clay, or whatever topsoil was put when the house was put down. And then how much moisture is in the soil there, and if it collects water already, or if it's a really dry high spot, that'll be a good factor on what kind of habitat you end up doing. If it ends up being a wetter type, like you have a ditch out front that you are tired of mowing or looking at, all of like the growth that's happening, there's ways to create that into more of a habitat, like a rain garden. And rain gardens can be made anywhere. It's a matter of just how much work is needed to create it. Rain gardens, generally you dig down or use an already existing depression in the ground, and you kind of dig it so that the water that flows off your house or off of the street goes into that heavily planted area, and it kind of sits and the roots will filter it and help it get back to, it slows down the water and gets back to the groundwater, or it slowly seeps into the river or drainage. The problem with fast-moving stormwater is that it picks up all the fertilizer or chemicals that people do put on their lawns or that exists from like our cars on our driveways and sidewalks, and it just goes right into that sewer system that often just drains into rivers. Or if you do live near a river or lake, then it does just drain off into that body of water if you just have grass. So by creating this ditch, it slows it down. Usually it involves a berm on one side, which will help slow down the water. And then sometimes people even attach their rain gutters into the depression directly, depending on how far away you have it from your house. And this one can be full of, in the middle, you kind of find plants that are more water tolerant. And then as you get towards the outside, you get the more dry or moderately wet plants. And these can be generally pretty lush with flowers. You can also use a mixture of grasses too. And there are native grasses that grow a bit taller and generally create like a foliage that stays through the fall, and it looks really pretty. The rain garden is pretty like labor intensive to the start. So another way that you can invite habitat into your lawn if you don't have a lot of space to dig down or create a garden bed. Way to do that is to just by planting more flowering trees or trees that produce nuts or berries. By doing this, you provide pollinators with nectar in the spring, like these red buds. I think a lot of them are just getting done with their blooming. And for oaks, obviously produce a lot of nuts. Serviceberry is a really good bush. Sumac, you'll probably see that all around. Midland, they kind of have those cone-shaped berries. And those ones are actually really good and to make like a sumac lemonade out of actually. So just like planting trees instead of that are native to the region and produce a flower or a fruit or a nut is a good way to compromise if you're not able to create a more extensive habitat. A pollinator plot is mostly just like a standard flower bed, but a specific thing with the pollinator plot is using native plants and then plants that bloom at different times of the year so that you always have, from spring to fall, you have a source of nectar and pollen. And then these ones are a little bit less manicured. You don't need to have the nice neat clusters and a bunch of weeding in between. You can kind of let them fill in and just be like a meadow, kind of that dense flower. And they can be really pretty when they are in full bloom. And a lot of native plant providers have a chart usually that tells you when they bloom and the color of the bloom. So it really helps when you go to choose. If you're hoping to attract a specific butterfly or bird, there's a great resource with the Audubon Society where you can put in your zip code and they will produce a list of plants that is good for your area. Another nice accent to pollinator plots are bee hotels. They're becoming a little bit more popular. And you can find them even in like Meijer, Home Depot. And a lot of the times they're in like a little structured house, and a lot of times it's just bamboo shoots. Because a lot of our native bees are actually solitary, so they need those little individual spaces. And there is ways to make them like look really cute. So you might be wondering, I'm asking you to make this wild space in your yard, that it might look overgrown or ugly if it's just like out of control. So there's certainly ways to make it pretty. You can have the garden edging to kind of put a unique spin to it. There's a lot of varieties, and kind of defines that area, makes it look like it's intentional space and planned. You get less calls from neighbors complaining about overgrown lawns. Lawn ornaments, there's plenty of lawn ornaments out there that you can kind of add in and make your own space. Edging is recommended because even just like putting the little like the black stuff around, because it's really easy for grass to kind of migrate into those spaces. And once it's kind of intermixed into your plants, it can be hard to fix. If you still want to be able to walk through that native area, the stepping stones and like some low growing plants is a good alternative to make it, even like a walkway could be like this. Having a water feature is another way to making it pretty. Down here, you'll see kind of the basics of a puddling station, which is kind of like a layer of compost or sand at the bottom, then those bigger rocks, and then even larger rocks, and then you pour water in it. Having that layer of compost or sand is really important because butterflies and bees will land in the shallow water to get nutrients. And you can, it's been seen on like river edges of them doing that. And they need that shallow water just so that they don't get submerged and stuck. If their wings get wet, it's hard for them to fly. There's ways to make habitat and still have that functional landscape. You don't need to take care, like remove your entire lawn. If you kind of determine the space that's normally used and then convert the areas that aren't used into habitat. Like this rain garden right here in front of the house, you still see there's a significant portion of lawn, but there's that depression that allows the street water to flow in and water the plants for them. And then sometimes when there's this kind of setup, there's like a drain ditch in the middle of it sometimes. And the same for the backyard. You'll have like you can design it so that there's patio space and a walkway, and there's ways to make it still usable, but providing that space for animals to hide and feed and make nests of whatever type they need. So the big concept of all of this is if many people do it, then we create an ecosystem within the city. So in the suburban one, you kind of just see trees, but you mostly see that open space. There's not places for people or for animals to hide and to that corridor for them to be able to walk through. But if everyone, like the one on the right, created habitat, then there's that continuous kind of grassy and trees and places for all sorts of wildlife to travel through and make it their home. And then on top of all that, you don't have to go very far to see cool animals. You can find them in your backyard. So the details, kind of getting more into the nitty-gritty of how to do this. So this is kind of like a sketch from landscape of kind of, you get your pathway, there's like a little bench, still a little grassy area, and they have a nice patio that's all surrounded by flowers, grasses, shrubs, some trees. It's a nice mix of wild and manicured. But you certainly don't need a detailed plan like this. But if that's how your mind works, of course, that's the way to go. Ways to kill your lawn. Certainly some places it's like struggling to get grass to grow. And then one time you do want to kill it off, that's when it decides to be resilient. One tactic is if you decide where you want it, you saturate the area of lawn with water and you put a tarp. This can be a dark tarp or a translucent tarp, and then you pin it down so that it traps that heat. And then you'll have this layer of dead grass and the roots won't be live, so it should be easy to rip off. If you don't have 6 weeks, there's always sod cutters. There's a variety of manual or one that's ran off like an engine, and then a shovel. It's a little bit more hard labor. You could always like hire a landscaper just to remove it and then do the work from there just to save money. Or there's organizations out there or companies out there that do install gardens. There is always the chemical option. I would say that's a last resort because depending on what chemical you use, it can have a lasting resort on like a residue on the next plants that you put in, or affect any bees and stuff that come in later. So down here is kind of an image of the tarp and what it looks like afterwards. There's a lot of plants that are used in landscape that are really bad for the environment. And they just kind of go haywire if they are left alone or if their seeds are dispersed in local forests nearby. One that I have personal experience with is Japanese barberry. It is used like everywhere, and it's very prickly. It's flowers like in the spring and then has these berries that kind of last throughout the winter. And usually it's kind of hedged. This picture right here shows like the two different main types that are used, is this red one and then that more lighter green. And usually they're kind of cut into a nice square or round. This one looks like it's more just grown wild. And they get really funky looking in the forest. And Japanese barberry is actually, it is very welcoming to ticks and mice. So it actually is not a very good plant for around your house either. Burning bush is also commonly used. It can tend to kind of grow everywhere. As with most invasive species, that's the big problem, is the fact that it grows densely and outcompetes our native plants that provide, like those host plants that can outcompete those, and then those butterflies and bees, birds are impacted because they don't have access to the plant. English ivy is a common ground cover and can sometimes crawl up walls. In some locations, it can take over a forest and make it really hazardous. Even like it can suffocate a tree and then it makes it hazardous to even cut that tree down because it connects that tree to the next couple trees, and then next you're cutting it down and it gets hung up, and it's really, really dangerous. Honeysuckle is everywhere. It's a nice flowering plant, but it grows densely and outcompetes our native plants. The list can go on. Definitely identifying the bushes and plants in your yard is always a good thing before you decide to save them. If you notice something kind of spreads in your yard, and if it leaves out really early, that's a pretty good sign that it wasn't actually meant to be here. Like our honeysuckle was leafing out like in March. Same with Japanese barberry. So you might be asking, okay, I have this area, how many plants do I need? Like, how much am I talking about here? The more complicated way to go about this is researching the plants you want, the amount of space that they need, and the average height that they do, or that they grow up to. The reason I point out the height is because if you plant something really tall in the front of your garden, you're not going to be able to see into all the other plants that you've planted. Wild type is a native plant producer out of Mason, Michigan, near Lansing. They have a really great chart that lists out all like the height, space, months that they bloom, and then even down to if it's a native phenotype, which gets down to like the genetics of the plant. Another way to go about it is just estimate one plant per square foot for herbaceous plants. And then your bushes and trees will obviously take up more space. As in this image, kind of recommend planting clusters of the same plant. You'll get more kind of that bang of that flower if there's them all together, versus if you kind of intersperse, it kind of gets blended in. And Michigan Audubon Society has a pretty great handout. There's a link here that I can send around this and some of the other documents that I'm referring to during this, after this. But they have kind of previously planned garden types and even down to the flowers. And you can kind of see like the spacing and the numbers of them. And then it even gives a description and the region in Michigan that it's good for. So in our like Home Depot, Meijer, and Lowe's, all those standard garden centers, a lot of times they actually sell cultivars, which is like a genetically bred to have a certain color or bloom a different way, so that they're more like pretty. But there is the one problem with cultivars versus the native plant is that genetic diversity is just gone. And there's actually a study from 2014 from, her name's Annie White out of the University of Vermont, that studied the difference between cultivars and native plants, and actually found that there's quite a few cultivars that are not actually, pollinators won't go to them as often as the native ones. So you might be thinking, oh, it's pollen is pollen, like I'm providing them food, but if they would prefer the native ones, they're not going to visit your plants as often. When you go to buy plants, how can you tell if it's a cultivar if you're trying to avoid that? Here is a capital letter in the name, which I then, So echinacea, I suck at Latin, but the E would normally be lowercase. But then there's this Magnus, and that's kind of the indicator that it's a cultivar, is that there's in that like quotes an extra name to it. And here in the photos is an example of that light purple is the native bee balm. And then one of the cultivar bee balms is this one on the bottom. They're kind of bred to be different colors, more vibrant colors, bigger. So you might be thinking, that sounds really complicated. Like, do I really need to use all native genotype plants? And I kind of set up a definitely a good and then kind of a lesser of the evils kind of scale. So you'd rather, if you can, do natives. If you can't do natives, cultivars. Definitely cultivars over the non-native, because non-native has that chance of being invasive, but also just not providing that benefit. And then avoid invasive species. You might be wondering, where do annuals fit in? I think of them as fillers, especially when you initially plant a garden. Those plugs that you put in are pretty small to begin with, but they can get really big. But to kind of just fill in that space in the meantime, you can use annuals because they will die after a year. It also protects your garden from new weeds coming into those spaces. Annuals can also be used as a way to change up color in your garden. But having that native base of perennials is always important if you want to provide habitat. If you have a favorite plant that you really want in your garden still, I would suggest putting them in pots, especially if they tend to spread. That's a way to keep them controlled, but you still see them, and you can more easily get rid of them. The importance of native plants, this image is used quite often now, and it kind of shows the scale of how deep roots go. Up here is your turf grass, the short little all the way to the left, and then you can see our native plants go like 20 feet down, some of them. Some of these longer ones are at 20 feet. So they go really deep, so they hold on to that soil, and they also filter all that water that goes through. So native plants are kind of it's not really available everywhere, but there are a few spaces near Midland that sell them either a certain time of year or have them available. So the Nature Center with Mid-Mittens Wildland chapter, they do a plant sale in May. We had originally planned to do this before the plant sale, so as to give everyone a reason to go buy plants. But then the flood happened and we had to postpone it a few weeks just so that everyone can kind of focus on what they needed to, which was their own house. Many of the plants that are sold around locally actually come from Wild Type down in Mason, Michigan. If you ever have time to go down there, they have weekend sales, so definitely check their website before just driving down there. It is a really cool place. Just like plants everywhere and like wetland plants growing, just any type of native plant, they got it there. The Michigan Wildflower Farm is also near Lansing, and they only do seed. but they deliver. So they have a website, and you can buy a mixture or a specific seed, and they'll mail it to your door real quick. A new location here in Midland is Nature Niche. They have a variety of garden supplies like bird feeders and signs and decorative stuff, but they also have tree sales occasionally, and they have like mixed seed mixes. So kind of like you buy it and it's like kind of a garden already. It gives you instructions and all that. Another resource is Gladwin High School. So just 45 minutes north of Midland. They do a plant sale every May. And it's usually native plants, but also vegetables and fruits. And it's all been grown by the students. It's kind of a project for their botany class. And then it's usually around Mother's Day that they have the sale at the school. And they're pretty reasonably priced too. Our local conservation districts have tree sales every fall and spring. And they usually have their lists available on their website. So you place your order, and then there's a specific date that you go pick them up. Before you go through and do one of these plans, always check your neighborhood policies. I looked at Midland, and there was mostly the weeds and grass and brush must be shorter than 10 inches. And then kind of instructions not to block traffic or pedestrian view. So one way to make sure you're not getting phone calls or suddenly someone's out there mowing your lawn and then you get charged afterwards. Making it look planned and then talking to your neighbors is always good. Let them know what you're doing. And like this image here, that's just like an overgrown lawn. That's kind of your general weedy spot. Then that's not really what we're looking for. We're more looking for the flowers, grasses, kind of that type of habitat. And then don't block the view of pedestrians or traffic is just good courtesy. If you plan to do between the sidewalk and the street, that's like definitely like keep it short and not too overgrown so that people can, especially if you're near like a street corner. Signage always helps. One program at Little Forks Conservancy is the Conservation at Home program. We come out, do an assessment on if you have habitat that's in place or trying to, and then we kind of can even give you some recommendations, help you identify if there is invasive species in your lawn. And then if you meet all the standards, then you get this nice sign right here that you can display in your garden, and people can know that you are making an effort to create habitat. If you have more questions on that program, you can contact Andrea Foster or AmeriCorps member Shelby Kane for an assessment. There's other programs like the Certified Wildlife Habitat through the National Wildlife Federation. That's what their sign looks like. Or you can make your own. There's fun signs that make it educational. Certainly dandelions aren't necessarily, they're not native, but they do provide that early food source for pollinators. But the sign could still apply when you in your garden. If you're trying to enact a plan that you've created and you come across a few questions, or you don't know where to start or don't know if something's invasive, here's some resources that you can reach out to, send a photo to or have someone come visit you. There's us. Any of us are able to help, especially with photos through email. The Mid-Mittens Wild One chapter is full of people who love to garden, love to have native plants in their yard. They were meeting about once a month with different activities. The Central Michigan Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, also known as SISMA, is the invasive species group in this area. They focus on Midland, Gladwin, Isabella, Gratiot, and I think one more. And they kind of do education, and they have a gear locker, kind of like a tool locker. There we go. With weed wrenches and injection needles. If you have like one of those plants that have like a Japanese knotweed, is a good one to use that on. They don't provide the chemicals, but they provide those tools and resources to know if it's invasive and the best way to get rid of it. And then your local conservation districts can also be helpful. And then Nature Niche is the new shop I mentioned. It's over near on Wackerly, just west of Eastman. And the owner of that is Martha. She's got like 15 years of experience in landscape ecology and was a consultant prior to opening her shop. So she is a great resource. There is I think a local chapter of the Audubon Society if you are really into birds. I think it's the Chippewa Valley Audubon Society, but they're also probably a good resource, or the Audubon website, like I mentioned. So the call to action, create a space using native plants. Tell your neighbors, encourage them to do the same. Maybe you can go in on an area and plant it together. And then talk about it online. Post your project and let people know what you're doing. I think it's a question. Work. Just a I can't see the chat box when I'm sharing my screen, so sorry if I missed anyone's questions. Stone cottage gardens. Yeah, as Alyssa said, if you have a question and you want to speak, just unmute yourself or type it in the box. I covered a lot of information. I can send you guys some resources afterwards. And this was recorded a little after I started, but then it'll be sent out to everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.
There is another one coming up in June 25th for invasive plants hiding in your land. So I'll go a little bit more in depth into ones that could be taking over those areas you're trying to convert to native spaces.
Thanks.
Hey, Sarah, can you talk a little bit maybe about some of the work Little Forks has done on our properties to restore native plants?
Yeah, so our Airwell Preserve has about 2 acres of native plantings. There's around the overlook, and then further down along the trail, there's 2 big openings that was converted or maintained as an open area and full of native plants. Also at Averill, we had the all access path built in 2017. We noticed there was like a low spot that would have a lot of water. So we kind of converted it into a rain garden. And then that's a really dense area of flowers that blooms right next to the path.
Is Averill accessible now after all the rain?
Not the low land trails. Those are still have a lot of trees over the trail and some silt. Well, a lot of silt. But, so far, we've been able to clear off the stairs at Riverview. And then we have plans to, we actively take out invasive species and then kind of working to restore some of our farmland at Riverview to more native plantings. And then just kind of constantly figuring out ways to, if there's an area that's a monoculture invasive species, that introducing that native seed.
Sarah? This is Jeannie. I got a question about milkweed. Maybe different people have had different experiences. We always talk about planting more milkweed for monarchs. Well, last year in one of my gardens, I had probably about 5 milkweed plants that all grew really healthy, and I got a lot of seeds from them. That same garden, I don't see any milkweeds growing in there at all right now, and it's getting the area is getting overrun by some of my other native plants, and I wonder if they're out competing the milkweed. We always talk about it being a perennial, but in my experience, I never get the same plant back in the same spot like other perennials.
Yeah, I've noticed.
Anybody else have any input on milkweed?
I've noticed in our garden out front of the office, it kind of migrates, so maybe it is seed-based. And then also at the office garden, our milkweed tends to like grow a little bit, and then something either nibbles it or just like breaks off. So that's another weird conundrum we're having. But so maybe just adding more of that seed back into the area will help have that seed bank to help it regrow.
All mine came back this year, and they came up back the exact same spot. So I know they're the same plant. So I don't know, Jeannie.
Yeah, because the same area now, it has more stiff goldenrod and yellow coneflower. And I noticed that my beard tongue, which is a white tube-shaped flower, I started out with probably 2 plants, and now I have probably 5 or 6, and they've spread into different areas where I didn't originally plant them. So they must be spreading by seed. And they've kind of all taken over this area where I had a few milkweeds last year. So.
Yeah, those beard's tongue can be pretty invasive. I shouldn't say invasive, aggressive plants.
but I like them because I always see
bees love them. Yeah.
Flowers, and supposedly it could be one for hummingbirds too.
And they're a little earlier.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen hummingbirds, but you always see like bumblebees with their butt kind of sticking out and all the way inside of the flowers.
Right. Yeah. I saw somebody had a question about are there plants left from the native plant sale, and Jen Kurtz told me she had about 160 plants left. So I don't know how many of those have been sold, since Sunday, but if you want to contact her or the Nature Center, she'll be able to tell you if there's anything left to buy.
Thanks, Jeannie. That was my question.
From what I heard, when you call the Nature Center, it goes to Jen's phone because nobody's in the office yet. Or you can email her. She's really good at email. So, yeah. So Sarah, when the preserves are back open again, will you guys post something on on your website?
Yeah, we will.
Where are your offices now?
We're all working at home. Our office, the bottom floor got flooded out.
Yeah, I know.
So we're all just working remotely still. We were prior to this because of the virus. You can see Alon working from home. So we're working, we have got a restoration crew, and they're gutting that entire bottom floor. And then
Okay.
it's owned by the home and studio. So
Yeah.
they're deciding what it's going to look like next. So.
Did you lose a lot of equipment in that lower level?
Not too much equipment, mostly just paperwork.
Hmm.
And our printer. There's it was mine, Alon, and Andrea's office were down there, so it was all of our paper work and textbooks. And Andrea lost her binoculars for her nature nurture program, and the journals that her students had written in. So.
Oh, no, not those. That's terrible.
Yeah, some invaluable stuff, unfortunately.
Oh, man. Yeah, that you can't replace. Unfortunately, those you really can't replace. Oh.
So, but we're figuring it out. We'll probably end up having a temporary space somewhere, but we'll see. Anyways, it's been about an hour. If anyone else has questions, feel free to email me. I hope this was helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.